It is so good to be here and connect with so many people and so many long-term friends. And to sit in the same pew with Wendy, who I've known forever, and to see her smiling face and to know that Doug is driving sound, so I need to be nice to Doug tonight. And that Suzanne is here, who was a roommate with Allison at the U of A when they studied there, and to have Allison come. Allison, it doesn't always get to come when I get to speak some places, and so she's with me tonight, and she continues to serve as high school principal at Rundle College and has been there since we moved to Calgary in 1992. And RMC, I should note, is celebrating the end of its 30th year. And I had no idea that I would ever last that long. I thought it might be 3 years and go and do something more interesting. And so it probably tells you that it's a pretty interesting job when you get to do what I've done for as long as I have. Thank you to the worship team. This works so well. It's the Holy Spirit leading us, and we'll see that as we walk through our time tonight. One of the roles that Al has had at Rundle College for a while was leading student trips. And I was able to go with her on some, and one of those took us to Ecuador. And on one of those, in that Ecuador trip, one of the days was whitewater rafting. And we got on the bus, drove through these mountains down to this river, arrived, and on the gravel are these rafts. And before we get in the rafts, the instructors were really careful, the guides were real careful and clear on giving us instructions about safety protocol. And I remember standing there listening with the students and all ears, because I'm not a person that likes to be in the water. I enjoy being on the water. And I wanted to make sure that I stayed on the water that day. And so they gave us this instruction, and they did talk about if you ever get into white water and everything appears to be chaotic and somebody pops out of the raft, they said, the first thing to do is this. And they said, when you look on the floor of the raft, there's a hook, a canvas hook. And they said, you make sure your foot goes into that hook. And the second thing you do is you make sure you put your arm through the rope on the inflated part of the raft. And you go like this, and then if somebody's out, you reach for them. You do not reach for them until you're well anchored. And that's great advice, because probably one of the things you can control in a situation like that is being anchored to something. And so I was all ears. And it was a great day on the water. Floated down and a number of whitewater rapids, and we had lunch on a sandbar, just a great trip. But in that experience with the whitewater, it does remind me of the age that we live in, because I really believe that we live in an age of whitewater. And John, when you prayed, you named some of the things that we live with today, constantly around us, unsettling things that create all kinds of change in our life. But not only events where people are drowning or dying, but moral kerfuffles, moral changes, ethical changes, situations that we don't necessarily agree with. And it's unsettling for us. Now, although today I've entitled my sermon Just a Pair of Shoes, we're not going to get to that until the very end, and you'll understand why I've chosen that. So you're going to have to ride with me for a little while. In this process, as I was thinking about all these kerfuffles, I was reminded of a sociological term. And though you and I might think of all this chaos as just chaos, sociologists actually have a term for it, and they call it anomie. Anomie, and it's on the screen there for you. And anomie means that you're living in a state of flux. And when they use the word anomie, what they mean is they're talking about the values that a civilization or a culture, or in our case, a Western world view, is changing. And you've had a set of values that you've been used to operating out of, and you have a pattern of life that's dictated by those values, and you're shifting to a new set of values. And as the new set of values come in, it creates a sense of chaos or confusion, and sociologists call it anomie. Anomie. And when I first heard this term, I thought, this suits North America. This suits North America. It suits the Western world. We have family in New Zealand. When you talk with them, it suits New Zealand. And it's this exchange of values that we live in, and we're not sure how we operate anymore. And so tonight, I'm hoping that I can give us some anchors to help steer us through this enemy, because I think we need anchors to guide us. Now, we're going to go to the Old Testament to look at this. The last time I was here in February 2020, I spoke from Philippians. None of you remember that, of course. Okay, I know that. I thought I'd have a quiz and just do it, but it would be a worse reflection on me than it would be on you. And so tonight we want to go back to Isaiah and to Isaiah chapter 6. And before we go there and before we have it read, I want to give you a little bit of context that surrounds this passage. And so this passage was written 700 years before Jesus. Okay? So that'd be 2,700 years before today. That's a long time, right? Some of us feel old, but we're nothing compared to that. When it's written, Israel is a mess. I know it's a technical theological term. Some of you might wrestle with that, but you can talk to Edith about that. Israel was a mess. They were a mess theologically. Idolatry, worship of pagan gods, a total disrespect for God himself. Governmentally, a mess. Justice-wise, there was no justice. There had been a group of people that had become super uber rich, and there was the very, very poor, and no one was caring for the poor. There was a sense of apathy in the land about spiritual things. Some people had grown lazy and didn't want to work. Superstition, sin, all these things that are unsettling were rampant in the day in which Isaiah wrote this. The other part of this passage is this is a key turning point in the life of Isaiah himself. I don't know if you've ever had those key moments in your life that you look back and you go, wow, that changed the trajectory of my life. And this passage encapsulates that for Isaiah. This is the beginning point of 50 years of ministry for Isaiah. So if someone is going to come and read for us tonight, right? Cool.
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on the throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to each other, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and whom will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you so much. You know, so I don't know if some of you do this, but sometimes in my mind I characterize passages of Scripture that I read. And some passages of Scripture I read, that's a happy passage. And if you want some happiness, you just go read that and you get some happy. And there's others where it's just teaching passage. That's a real teaching theological passage, the book of Romans. When I think of this one, I think of a Mike Yaconelli story that I read a long time ago, and it was him interpreting when Jesus calmed the water in the boat and made the storm stop. And Yaconelli described it this way. He said, "What would you think of Jesus at that moment?" And he said, "I would say, don't make him mad." this is a don't make him mad passage. Okay, we see this immense picture of God himself. And it's kind of like a 1970s rock show. There's flashing and banging and crashing, and the thresholds are shaking and banging, and there's all these angels with 6 wings flying around. Very, very unusual. Something that is totally foreign in our day. So for some of you, if you went to the Bible college world at ever in time in your life, it may have been what you would refer to as the go passage. Wendy just smiled at that because we went to the same Bible college. And when I talk about the go passage, I think of how many missionaries came and spoke in chapel. And we had chapel every day when I went. And the missionaries would come and irrevocably, they would preach from this passage. And then they'd say, this is go. We need missionaries to go. And I'm not saying that's not important tonight. Please don't hear me say that's not important. But I want to draw our eyes away from the go to something different tonight. Something that I think can help us and to anchor us in our life. I don't know if you are this way, but some of us are wired when we see a mess, we just want to fix it. You know, you're driving somewhere and you see a mess and you almost want to crawl out of your car and fix it. You walk by someone's bedroom and you look in and this is a train wreck and you just want to fix it. Or, you know, you see something on TV, political or whatever, you just want to fix it. Because there's some of us that are wired as fixers. Now, some of us, we respond differently. We're just lovers. We just want to love everybody and hug everybody to fix a mess. Some of us are analyzers, right? We can analyze a mess and we can pick it apart and put it in pieces and categorize and plunk, 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 and now we know. Some of us are strategists. We go, this is how I would fix it. My sister's that way. Wherever we go with her, she's going to fix the service in a restaurant. She's going to fix the construction on the traffic. She's going to fix everything, right? Most of the time it wouldn't work, but she's a fixer. She's a strategist. Some might be wired like a warrior. You know, you're just a giver. Let's just give her. You don't care where you're going to give her, but you're just going to give her when you see a mess, right? And some of you are what I call Tim Hortons fixers. Just go to Tim Hortons and have a good cup of coffee. That's how you respond to a mess. Well, it'd be interesting to see how God responds to a mess. How God responds to a mess, because Israel is a mess. And it's interesting to see what he does. And so in this picture of God's response, and we read it in Isaiah chapter 6, here is this immense creator God, the creator of the entire universe, with all the power in his hands and his mind and his abilities. He can do anything in the world. And he knows Israel's a mess. And what does he do? And what does he do? Well, you know, he comes and he reveals himself personally to Isaiah, doesn't he? He finds a very, very personal and intentional way to speak to Isaiah. And in this case, it's through a vision. And he intentionally came to Isaiah to show Isaiah who he really was. He wanted Isaiah to know him and the kind of God he was and what he was like. And he came to a single person. He didn't come to the whole tribe of Israel. He could have. He could have created locusts, famines, all this other stuff that he'd done previously, but he didn't. He came to Isaiah personally, as a personal individual, in a personal way. And then as the scriptures talked about, the seraph brings a coal and touches his lips, and it takes away all his sin. And it gives Isaiah a second chance, a new hope, and eventually a new role. So if you were to think of an anchor, I'd suggest to you that there is an anchor revealed in this process. And I would describe it this way, and it's going to pop up on the screen here. And in this anchor, I think this is what God's doing. He says, although God is being rejected publicly at that time, God is very active personally. Although God is being rejected publicly and is quiet publicly, he's very active personally. And I think of that as the state of Canada today. There's days that my heart just aches that God would do something to fix the ills in all of our land and just wash it in some way and make it better. And there's a side to me at times that I get frustrated that he doesn't. And I'm reminded in this passage that though God appears to be quiet publicly, he is still very active personally. And I need to live out of that reality rather than the reality that I wish that he would do something publicly. And I need to trust him in that. And I need to believe that he is active in the midst of the enemy in which we're located today. Move on and talk about another anchor that I see. And this one comes out of verse 5, Isaiah chapter 5, or 6, verse 5. And maybe you want to go back to your device and read it with me. It's a pretty simple one, actually. It doesn't need a lot of explanation. Woe to me, he cried, I'm ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. When we read that, we need to remember that Isaiah was an Israelite. And Isaiah was a person, as in Israel, as a chosen member of God's race, a special person. And they viewed themselves as separate and distinct from the people around them. They were different. They were God's chosen people, and others weren't. They were Gentiles. And so they received special favors, special blessings from God himself. So when Isaiah says to us, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among people of an unclean lips, he's making a significant statement that says simply this: I am no different than the people around me. I am no different than the people around me. In street language today, Isaiah probably would have said it this way: I'm a mess. I'm a mess. You ever hear anyone say that to you? I'm a mess. And he would say, I live among a people that are a mess. And what he's saying is, I'm no different than the people around me. In the midst of all this enemy, in the midst of all this idolatry, in the midst of all this sin, and all this mess of unfair justice, I'm no different than anybody else around me. I am the same as the people I live among. And so I look at the people on my street that I live among. They don't all agree with me. They don't all live like I do. In fact, some of them have some pretty severe difference of opinion on many things than I do. But the other side of it is, guys, they are the same as I am. They have the same desires hardwired into them about having a purpose in life, about having meaningful relationships, about feeling like they're valued, respected, cherished, loved, and cared for. The same feelings that I have inside me, in the sense that I am a person and they are a person. It was this moment and this realization that changed the trajectory of Isaiah's life. From that moment on, Isaiah responded to the call of God to be a prophet for his kingdom. and to represent him. And in that day, prophets weren't all that well received. In fact, they were often rejected and maybe even hated. Now, some of it may have been caused by their own way of sharing that, because prophets, many of them, when you read the Old Testament prophetic books, it's like they were angry people. and often came across as saying that they were better than the people that they were prophesying to. Today we might say to them, you need to go to an anger management class, buddy. Okay? So some of the self-hatred was earned by their own actions. They were often yellers, and they yelled at people. Not Isaiah. Isaiah was different. And when you read the book of Isaiah, though Isaiah confronted, though Isaiah told the truth, and was very honest with them, he always did it with mercy attached. He always did it and said that, but you may be like that, but there is hope for you. And in fact, the book of Isaiah is filled with prophecies about the coming of Jesus that became an anchor point for the tribe of Israel for years and years and years until the time of Jesus and when Jesus arrived. Because of his mercifulness, because of his actions. Some of you might know this poem that I'm going to recite for you. Fortunately, it's short. That's the only way I can remember it, because I don't memorize well. Rudy toot toot, Rudy toot toot. Some of you are laughing already. Rudy toot toot, Rudy toot toot. We're the boys from the Institute. We don't smoke, and we don't chew, and we don't go with girls who do. That's the whole poem. Rudy toot toot, Rudy toot toot. We're the boys from the Institute. We don't smoke, and we don't chew, and we don't go with girls who do. And for some of us, and some of our forefathers, that was their way of summarizing their attachment to Jesus. And they named themselves and identified themselves by what they were opposed to. And part of that poem is to say, I'm different than. I'm different than the people I live among. I don't smoke, I don't chew. And the list that we used to have in conservative Christian homes was often quite long. And some of you would know more about this than I do. Some of you don't have a clue what I'm talking about. Okay? But see, Isaiah doesn't do that. Isaiah doesn't go Rudy toot toot, Rudy toot toot. He said, I am no different than. I am a mess, and I live among people that are a mess. And it's that recognition that allows Isaiah to have a prophetic ministry that was different than any other. And because he acknowledges this mess, he became a prophet of mercy, even though he lived in the midst of a kerfuffle or flux or enemy. You see, the anchor is acknowledging reality fostered a life of mercy. Because he named the reality that he was no different than anyone else, he lived a life of mercy. That's a simple anchor, isn't it? Pretty simple. Edith could expand on it theologically for us, right? But it is. But here's the sad part. You and I, on purpose, you and I can miss that simple truth on purpose. We can miss it on purpose. In fact, there's another Old Testament prophet that does in the Old Testament. And if you were to read the book, you would probably think of it as a children's story, or maybe a song that you learned in children's ministry. And if you were to turn to the book of Jonah and you read the whole book of Jonah, you could probably tell me the story of the book of Jonah tonight, right? What happened to Jonah? Pardon? God calls him to go to where? And where does he go? Tarshish. Okay, yeah, okay. And then what happens?
He gets swallowed up. Goes on the Mediterranean Sea, there's a storm, he gets tossed overboard, swallowed by a fish, he may or may not die, he then is spit back up to the land, and he goes to Nineveh, preaches, they repent, he gets mad, curses everything, including his own life, and God says, I have every right to have mercy on them, who do you tell me who I have mercy on, who I have not?
Bingo. Exactly. Okay? And
Years later, they all died.
yeah, exactly. It's perfect. Okay? It's a great story, isn't it? But you know, when we read it as an adult story, there's another side. It's a horrific story. It's a horrific story. Because he goes, he preaches, and it says the whole city, in just a matter of a few days, became followers of this God. They repented and were saved. And what's the sad part? What does Jonah do? Goes outside the city, sits himself down, and pouts. And pouts. And God gives him a little plant to give him shade, and he still pouts. Right? Let me read to you what it says in Jonah. But to Jonah, chapter 4, verse 1, but to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, that all these people had become followers of God. And he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were gracious and compassionate, a God who is slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. And then in verse 9, he wraps it all up, puts a bow on it this way. It is, he said, and I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. Even though God had done wonderful things, Jonah's mad at God. And he missed out on purpose, this beautiful gift that had happened. You know, sometimes we can miss out on purpose. You know, sometimes we don't want to be merciful to ourselves. I think sometimes the hardest person for us to be merciful to or think that God would forgive is ourselves. Sometimes we just can't imagine that. Some of us, we may like to live in our misery. That's our identity, and we've learned to live in that. There's others of us that we just can't imagine that someone else could change, that God could actually change someone else's life. And by doing those kinds of things, we can actually miss out on purpose, the goodness that God can bring. Or some of us don't believe that others are the same as us, really, deep down. And so we miss out. We miss out. And so we can live in a world of flux or enemy. And we miss out on the opportunity to share Jesus with those people in their pain, in their loss. Because we ourselves don't have that anchor that says to us, I am a mess, and I live among a people that are a mess. Let's go back to Ecuador. We ride the raft all the way down. We have lunch on the sandbar. We get back on the raft, and we're coming to the end. And we come to this nice quiet water, and we kind of pull off to the side. And our guide in the back of our raft says, okay, guys, I just want to remind you, when I say this side paddles, and when I say this side paddles, and I'm on the left-hand side about 3/4 of the way back, and I'm all ears, and I'm listening. And so, because ahead of us is about a 1/4 mile of really, really rough water. And on the one side was this massive boulder about the size of a round bale that you see in the field when you go through a farming community today. And so we get in there, and we're in this white water, and we start to go toward this great big rock, and it's on my side. And I'm going, oh man, are we going to hit this thing? And we get real close, and then all of a sudden the raft just slid to the right, and we went around it, and we came out. And just as we're coming out, I look up, and here's two of the guys in the front of the boat, and they're standing up in the boat, and they're reaching out and picking up a person in the water, pulling them out, and lifting them back into the raft. What I didn't realize was that the person that they were lifting into the raft was our guide. And what had happened is when we first hit the water and we started to slide down this slope towards that big rock, the raft rooster-tailed and flipped our guide ahead of the raft. And these two big students in the front, they anchored themselves, literally. They put their feet in the hoop on the bottom, they put their other arm through the rope, and they reached out and grabbed our guide and grabbed him and heaved him into the boat, and he landed right beside me. And I go, thank goodness. I mean, we're through the stuff and we're safe. But the key of the whole thing was that they were anchored, because that allowed them to grab him and to pull him in. And guys, when we live in the state of chaos and flux that we live in culturally today, we need to be anchored in the simplest of things. We need to remember that God is active personally in and around us, even though publicly it doesn't appear to be. And secondly, that we are no different than the people that we live among. That those people are just like us. And as Romans 5:8 says to us, God loved us while we were yet sinners. And he loves the people that we live among. I had coffee with a former student about 6 months ago. And this student works in a 12-step program, an addictions program. And he talked about sitting at a coffee shop here in Calgary one afternoon with another person that was a leader in the 12-step program. And they were talking about this for quite a while at this table in this coffee shop. They'd been going back and forth, and they were just getting up to leave when this gentleman at a table beside them turns to them. And he said, excuse me. He said, I couldn't help overhearing. But I think you guys were talking about an addictions program that you're involved in that is helping people. Is that right? And they said, yeah, that's what we're talking about. No need to apologize. And he says, well, I'm so glad I heard you today, because I have a drug addiction and I'm looking for help. And these two guys, they just said, come on over, sit down, and let's talk. Okay? I'm a mess. I live among a people. They're a mess. I'm a mess. And I live among a people. They're a mess. So, tonight, I'm not here to tell you to sign up for small groups or evangelism programs or any of that kind of stuff. That'd be very irresponsible of me to do that. What I'm challenging all of us is to check our attitudes toward the people around us that we live among. That we would have an anchor that says, I'm no different than the people I live among. A few weeks ago, some members of our family went to the Air Jordan movie. And we watched that, and I'm aware that the language wasn't great. But in this marketing gig that they were going back and forth in the marketing of Michael Jordan when he was going to enter the NBA, this phrase came up. And it was Michael's father as they talked with the marketers. And they're talking about marketing him and creating this shoe. And this is what his dad said. It's just a shoe until someone puts it on. It's just a shoe until someone puts it on. My question is, you go to your closet or wherever you have your shoes and you put them on this week, is what attitude will you have when you put your shoes on? Because it's just a pair of shoes until you put them on. May God make it so. Amen.